How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm going to read the bio that you sent me. And this is in Kate's words. Kate is so grateful to participate in activism, art, and community building in this beautiful and challenging state of California. And I would definitely agree with that challenging part. She is co-founder of Moral Mondays Los Angeles and is helping move forward the work of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And she serves as one of the co-chairs for California. She lives in a conscious community with her partner and really just wants to figure out how we can all be more human with each other. Welcome to the Robust Opposition.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
You're very welcome. Why don't you talk about the four pillars, and I'll ask you some specific questions about the strategy and the 40 days and everything after you give the overview of the Poor People's Campaign.
My pleasure. So the Poor People's Campaign was originally launched 50 years ago by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. During also when the Memphis sanitation workers strike was happening. And what he was doing was addressing these three pillars in 68 of racism, poverty, and the war economy, and was directly speaking a lot about how our economic system works and the war in Vietnam. That campaign never reached all of its goals, and he was assassinated. But then 50 years later, here we are launching the new Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and we carry on the three pillars that he was bringing, plus two more, actually. So it's racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and our country's distorted moral narrative, which specifically is talking a lot about conservative Christian nationalism.
Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about William Barber, because he is so central to the Poor People's Campaign.
So Dr. Reverend William Barber is an evangelical preacher that comes out of North Carolina. Before he was the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign nationally, which is based out of DC. He was doing Moral Mondays, which was a fusion coalition effort that was built over the past decade to go every Monday and protest at the state legislature to basically try to fight all of the racist gerrymandering laws, voter suppression laws, things like that transgender bathroom bill, which also had so much else in that bill hidden that was going to be taking away people's rights. And they went every Monday and they protested. And what he did was he built a coalition saying, can we all come together across all these lines that divide us, different people of different faiths, non-faiths, people that are gay, people that are straight, and really have a less political view about what we need to fight for. And so he built that over the past decade, and that really gave birth, plus all the work that's been done over the 50 years, to the new Poor People's Campaign, and he's at the head of the national campaign.
Right. Now, he was talking about coalitions, and specifically he used the term fusion coalition. And he said that's a little different from the kind of coalitions that groups get in and out of, on an issue by issue basis. Can you talk about the coalition of the groups that are in the Poor People's Campaign, and what does that look like to be a fusion coalition?
It looks very different than any traditional coalition, primarily in the way that it is intersecting across all lines. So that looks like, on a national and for California, a statewide basis, basically trying to bring in all of the different groups in their different silos of work where they're fighting for social justice and bringing them across their lines into one movement where you're not only transactionally sitting in a coalition that says, okay, well, if I join this, then what do I get in return? But it's more a new narrative, which is much deeper than organizational coalition building, saying, can you come and stand up for someone else and their injustice and all of the things that are affecting them just as much as your own? And can you also see that all of the things that we're fighting for have an interlocking structure and system underneath, which all are rooted in the same thing, which is economic inequality, which is deep systemic racism that's built into all of our infrastructures, which is the commodification of the earth, which are the privatization of all things in America. And then you can really see in the fusion that we're all dealing with the same problem. So if we can come together and mobilize on an intersected level, do we have the possibility to actually overturn things that feel almost impossible to overturn, which are federal policies that are making the rich richer?
In my lifetime, the two movements that resonated most with me were the Occupy movement and the Bernie Sanders movement, because both of them were big tent movements that kind of talked about the 99% versus the 1%. And I feel that when we had, Occupy was great because it changed the national conversation away from the phony issue of the deficit to income and wealth inequality. And I think the Bernie Sanders campaign took it to the next step because Occupy eschewed electoral politics. And I think that we know that Martin Luther King was part of a social movement. The civil rights movement is a social movement. And yet they needed to make the changes that they wanted to make through legislation, so that they had to have an electoral component. They had to have a legislative component. And Bernie Sanders sort of brought that in. And he also talked about that it was obscene for people to make the kind of money they make, some of these billionaires and millionaires. He brought, I thought, the moral element into his democratic socialism. How do you think that, and the Bernie Sanders campaign did not succeed. Now, Bernie is still out there plugging away. I think he's gotten a lot of these mainstream politicians to come over to his side. We have candidates that we call corporate establishment Democrats, like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, that all of a sudden are talking about single payer health care and, guaranteed jobs for all because of Bernie Sanders moving the party to the left. But ultimately, people are very cynical that the corporate interests are going to allow social movements like this to prevail. So I guess my question is, how do you think, what is the Poor People's Campaign doing differently so that it will succeed where the Occupy movement and the Bernie Sanders movement did not? And I know that's a big question.
That's a really great question. I'm just one part of this growing movement. And though I'm helping to lead what's happening in California, I couldn't really say definitively. It would be totally an error for me to assume or be able to say what it's going to do differently, because what we're about to start tomorrow, right, the 40 days launch of this campaign, is the birthing of it. So what we've been doing to prepare is try to build something nationally that is disciplined, that is in the philosophy and in the strategy of nonviolence, that really begins to talk about in a very, very overt way, what does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to come together and try to build something that also Dr. King talked about, right? A beloved community and agape. And that's a part of this campaign, which in one way, I think delineates it just that we aren't coming together just to organize. We're coming together to try to actually see the value of human life other than our own and try to understand what that means and what it's going to take to be able to do what Bernie did, to be able to do what Occupy did, plus really have results that aren't immediate, but are policy changes that can be enacted over a 10-year, a 20-year movement that actually lets us see in this generation a shift in the policies. So I think what we're trying to do as well with the list of national demands that all of the states are going to be carrying out for the next 40 days in over 30 capitals is the way that we can try to make sure that it is effective, and that while the corporate America is pushing so hard to make sure that people's rights are impinged upon more and more and more, that we're going to say, listen, there are 30 state capitals that are standing up for a clean, renewable energy bill to be passed, right? Or we all want a clean sanitation public water system that is prioritized in policy over oil and fracking. We all want to make sure that there is universal health care, that we have guaranteed basic income. We want to make sure that the 2017 federal reform tax bill is repealed. So we are doing a bit of an inside out strategy just in terms of we're not only mobilizing a social movement, but we also have policy centers working with us and people that really understand on the quantitative side what it is going to take financially for us to, as poor people, get the check that we have deserves to be able to live a life and not just survive. And this is the same fight that's been happening forever with no avail. So we're just trying to pick it up a little bit more and say, if every state can join, is that going to change the narrative?
Now, how long did it take? Because I remember going to what I thought was the launch of the Poor People's Campaign in Los Angeles, maybe about 6 months ago, and covering that in the church. How long from the start of the organizing did it take for you guys to get? Now, I'm confused because I thought I heard him say 40 states, but now you're saying 30 capitals. So how many states?
So there's over 40 states that have, there's over 40 states that have their own Poor People's campaigns in their states organizing. And right now, because each state has different types of actions that are happening, I think that the last report that I heard is that there are going to be over 30 state capital actions happening, but there are over 40 Poor People's campaigns.
And how long has this taken to get this done, and how have you guys been organizing?
We've been organizing with a lot of heart and a lot of determination. Basically, what you saw and covered on December 4th was the kickoff of the Poor People's Campaign, which we didn't invite any press or media to outside of, I didn't actually even know anyone covered it, but I'm glad that you did. But we didn't invite any large media channels in LA because that launch was almost an internal launch to bring in the community members who are poor and impacted, the community organizations who are not nonprofits, who have been doing the work on the ground for decades. And it was more important campaign to make sure that the launch at the first concentric circle was really about making sure that people in the center of the leadership, people that are coming to the table, are poor and impacted. And I think that's also something very unique and important. It's critical in this campaign, is that we aren't speaking as organizers for anyone. We're not telling people what poor people need. What I am doing is helping to support that any impacted person across California could come into this campaign, find their space, and be able to be in the leadership of being able to say, what does a Poor People's Campaign look like in California? What are the needs of the impacted communities? What do we need to be able to fix? So that launch was almost a pre-launch.
I noticed that you said not nonprofits, and that made me think of my friend General Jeff Page, who I'm sure you know, who organizes on Skid Row. He was the first one to tell me the term poverty pimps. And he was referring to, he was referring to organizations like Missions and United Ways and all these groups that get a ton of money to serve poor people and end up paying their CEOs, $300,000 a year. And they do call them CEOs, which is very interesting because that's what a corporation calls their head. They don't call them like executive directors. They call them CEOs, which is interesting.
Right.
And you specifically said, if I heard right, not nonprofits. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. My personal opinions aside, when I just say that there is a difference between nonprofits and then grassroots organizations, I think there is a place in the Poor People's Campaign, first for everyone and people that have a much harder argument against them than nonprofits. And by that, I mean, there's even a place in this campaign specifically for poor white people who have voted for Trump, say, and they don't really actually believe in most of the pillars that they exist in the Poor People's Campaign, but this campaign is also for them, truly fusion. At the same time, the reason that I delineate that it's important to not just have nonprofits, but people that are grassroots is because from lack of funding, from lack of media access, from lack of resources that would allow people to see their work, a lot of these organizations, especially in LA, have been doing work that isn't seen or endorsed or funded in the same way that a lot of larger organizations are. And those people have been in the trenches for decades creating this work. It's the people that also were working with Dr. King. So it's just very important for us in the Poor People's Campaign to acknowledge that the work starts at the very bottom, and that sometimes nonprofit bottom rung of the impacted leaders who really understand what it's going to take to turn this all around.
Well, there is a term for it also. It's called nonprofit industrial complex. And a lot of these organizations, they need to get money, and sometimes they settle for incremental wins. Like especially I was fighting fracking, and a lot of the organizations that supported this really weak, what they called fracking regulatory bill that didn't even really regulate fracking and actually ended up expanding fracking. My contention was that they supported it so that when it passed, which it easily would because the oil industry pretended to fight it, but they were really behind it, then they could say, oh, look at we've passed, and they literally referred to it as the strongest anti-fracking regulations or the strongest fracking regulations in the country. Now give us money. Getting back to what you were saying about organizing poor people. Now I imagine that must be very difficult because poor people are so busy trying to just scrape together some nickels and dimes just to put food on their table. How do you reach out to poor people and convince them that this is worth taking their scarce time to work on?
It's so different for each person because 140 million people in America are poor, and in California, right, 55% of Californians are living with low wages or in poverty. That's such a huge amount of people. There can be no blanket statement about what it would take those people as humans, as individuals to join. I think there are definitely limited resources and capacities as a bottom line that sort of goes across everyone that is impoverished. They don't have a lot of the privilege, whether it's based on the system of racism or incarceration or their education or their time or their job, whatever it might be. There are limits to what people might be able to do to join and come to, say, tons of meetings. But what we're trying to do is build up a system that lets them come in when they can, and to see the value of this campaign trying to push for radical restructuring of what it looks like to be poor in this country, and actually then change it so poverty could be abolished, not in a utopic time frame of 100, 500 years from now, or perhaps some people even think that it's never going to be abolished, but to say, when you can, come and see this campaign, come speak and talk about what it's like to be impacted, come tell your leaders what it's like to be impacted. And what we're trying to do is build up enough of a platform that it amplifies their voice, that they can see the value of coming into something where also people that don't look like them, that are suffering from other issues, are also saying, I'm actually suffering in a very similar way. I can see how all these injustices are interlocked. Let's build a community that has enough mobilizing power to actually change what my paycheck looks like, what the water system underneath my house looks like, how far away, fracking or refinery is from my house, what it looks like for clean air, what my job looks like if I work in a system that actually is also commodifying the earth, but it's my way to make a living. We want to address all of those really hard lines that people face in poverty. So I think, we're just doing our best to create a platform that invites them in, and to also start at least having some type of support even over the 40 days, that anyone that wants to come, we're offering them a place to lay their head at a church near the Capitol. Anyone that wants to come and needs a ride, we're organizing carpools because we're also the Poor People's Campaign. We're very poor. We don't have, ways to offer a lot of financial assistance almost as, a donation to people. But what we're trying to do is build a movement that also they see their value in, because it's reflecting and is built on the struggles that they are facing.
Why don't you talk about what's happening in Sacramento tomorrow, and also what we can expect to see over the next 40 days?
So tomorrow is the launch of our 40 days of nonviolent moral fusion direct action. And what that means is a combination of direct action that is based in the principles of Kingian and Gandhian nonviolence, also based in the nonviolent strategy and philosophy of Reverend Dr. James Lawson. And it's also a chance for people to come together in solidarity in rallies. So what we're doing in California tomorrow is we will have a press conference and a program that's starting at 2 p.m., which will be different leaders of different faiths. We will have people from the local indigenous community as part of it as well. And then we'll have a few different impacted speakers that will talk about their experience and why they have joined the Poor People's Campaign. And that one will be addressing the weekly theme of week 1, which is women, children, and people with disabilities living in poverty and the right to education. And then after that, we will have a direct action as well.
And what about the next 40 days? Can you give us an overview of what to expect?
Sure. So each week we'll be doing pretty much the same program where we will be having a press conference, which is amplifying the voices of different impacted people. And all of the demands over the 40 days will be also echoed throughout California and in the press conference and in the media, because one thing that we're trying to do in the 40 days is make sure that we can break through the corporate media cycle, so that across the nation, there's a better chance that people hear the words poverty, that people are talking about racism on the nightly news, that people are talking about ecocide or the commodification of our earth until the point of no return. And what we want to do in the 40 days, when we have all of those demands being told, we are going to basically cover all of the different themes of the Poor People's Campaign and the people we're trying to stand with. So we're also covering, say, in week 2, we will be covering systemic racism and poverty, and what does that intersection look like? We will be talking about mass incarceration. We will be talking about xenophobia, Islamophobia, the mistreatment of indigenous communities. There's another week that we're talking about militarism, veterans, and the war economy. The 4th week, we are talking about ecology, the right to clean air, water, talking about oil and extraction. We're also talking about the right to unionize, the right to a living wage, guaranteed basic income, the right to housing and social services. So basically what we're doing is all of the groups that have so far joined the campaign, we will be covering all of the themes so that the 40 days is a birth here what every single issue is that poor people are dealing with in California. And then you'll also hear what are the demands that we're asking for, which will address all of those issues that you hear about from impacted people. So it's really a launch of tons of different people coming from all over California to talk about why they're joining the Poor People's Campaign, and to have people with more privilege to stand as allies and be in rallies with us to be able to show their support for the campaign.
Well, I don't want to rain on your parade, because my show is designed to highlight all progressive social movements, candidates, issue campaigns. But I have to say, as somebody who's been an organizer and an activist and who's organized rallies and protests myself for going on 8 years now, I have to say it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get the media to cover any of this, because, you know, I wrote a note when I was listening to Reverend Barber, and he was saying the media should stop focusing not on Trump, but on his harmful policies. And I've said as much myself, but they don't do that because it's not in their interest to do it. It's like they say they're giving the people what they want, but the people don't know what they want because they're not given the information, and it becomes a vicious cycle. Which is why when I did, you know, protests against net neutrality, fracking, the TPP, I would do my protests at Hillary Clinton, well, when Obama was president, at Obama fundraisers, and when Hillary was running, at Hillary fundraisers, because I knew that the local news would come out and cover that, and I would just make, you know, give them something controversial so they wouldn't just ask their usual questions, which is, oh, how is the president's visit affecting your commute tonight? You know, they go up to people in cars and they ask that stupid question all the time. So, I mean, do you have any strategies for getting the mainstream media to cover you? And in reality, do you really need the mainstream media to cover you?
I think that's a really good point, and I think it's a huge hurdle, and it's not raining on the parade. I know that so many people have been doing this work and trying to get a more national perspective to actually reflect the truth of what people are doing and suffering from in America. It's very, very hard. I don't think that we need it, but what I hope could happen if we do break through the corporate cycle a little bit would be, how does it happen first? I would hope it would happen because when people turn on the news, whether it's on social media or whether it's on their news channel, there are going to be over 24, over 30 different states doing the same thing with the same message, having a very unified platform. And that's something that has never been done before. There have been many movements, but even the first Poor People's Campaign and what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing, he wasn't able to organize and effectively make sure that 30 different state capitals were echoing what he was talking about about the war in Vietnam at the same exact time, literally the same day, for a sustained period of 40 days. So what we're hoping is that the form and the strategy catch on to the media, and that they really see that this is not something that is a flash in the pan. This isn't a moment that we're just building to get tons of supporters and then they go home and they never see any fruit of what actually came out of the speeches, that we're actually just starting, and that we're hoping also that there's a different strategy which incorporates many different sides, that people across the country, especially even on social media, will help to break through some of those walls as well, to be able to see that the entire nation is building, and with enough buzz. And you know what happened in Standing Rock, right? There are many fights all over the world, way before Standing Rock, that have been fighting to have people hear about what is happening on so much stolen land, right? And something happened in Standing Rock with media, especially in digital storytelling, that broke through a narrative that let 10,000 people come at once because they were seeing something of value. That's what we also want to do. And that's my personal opinion. I went to Standing Rock, and I think, I'm just grateful that other people were doing work and also visualizing it and telling the story of when they were there, because that helped me to see it. And I would have never heard about it on the news or on an online news channel unless people were also actively empowering themselves to share what they were doing. So that's something else that we're going to be hopefully employing across the nation. Mm-hmm.
I interviewed Chris Hedges a couple of times, and he wrote a great article. The last time I interviewed him was at Occupy Inauguration, and he was on a panel with Kashama Sawan and Chase Iron Eyes and Jill Stein and David Cobb. And he had just written an article where he interviewed Michael Gegan, who Gecan, who was with the International Yards Group. I think it's some organization in New York. And he was talking about how the organizing has to be organic and it has to come from below. You can't come in to a community and tell them. And I see this is what we're doing now with fracking, and we're doing it with even single payer. We're coming in to the community, going door to door, going to parks, going to places where we're going to find people, which is good. I mean, that's what we need to do. But we're kind of telling them, this is the most important issue you should be working on, getting single payer healthcare, or stopping this fracking in your community, as opposed to asking them what they want to organize about. And I want to interview these organizers in North Carolina, if I could figure out where I wrote their names, because that's exactly what they're doing. The woman was in Waynesville, North Carolina, and they go around and they ask people, what is the most important issue impacting you? And sort of based on that, they are deciding what they're going to organize around. So it's a little bit more of a bottom up than a top down approach. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, to me, that there seems like there's some type of gap sometimes between, say I'm talking to a new friend that I meet after a mass meeting for the Poor People's Campaign, right? It might be their first meeting. They're coming and they're not part of Fight for 15, but they're working in a low-wage job, and they've never experienced what it means to be, an activist, or they haven't been in touch with a local organizer for anything, and they're just coming because they're interested. What they are talking about at first, and you ask, what is it that is making you suffer? What are you dealing with? There's a common theme behind it, right? It's either in Los Angeles hearing about pimps, right? Because they live in a neighborhood where it's near some type of plant or some type of factory that is producing these chemicals, but they also then can't mitigate that because they don't have healthcare. They might also say that, well, I have to sometimes choose between which my electricity and which month I pay my water bill. I have to make ends meet at the end of the month, or I don't even have enough money in SNAP, whatever it might be. And so it's just people talking about their day-to-day as a human being, trying to struggle and survive and live in America. What organizers, after listening, can do is that there is then the full side of organizing and activism that has that language and also that experience of what does that connect to actually be able to change it. Like, what is, so if if they're at the core of being able to understand what is facing poor people and we're listening, then what this campaign can do and what it's doing with the national demands is it's all of the different people that are part of the campaign. And it's then creating policies and demands that are trying to say, does this directly address what you're facing? And I find that if you look at the list of national demands, it's absolutely not creating something that feels like it's very crafted or very intellectual, but it's saying we need a public water system that's prioritized over fracking. We need to have corporations that are not prioritizing making more. We need to have more, high quality, public funded, diverse education. We're not saying exactly what that looks like because that's not the point. What we're saying is and then that is what we are demanding.
Okay, so I'm listening to this and I keep hearing in my mind public bank, because I'm part of the Public Bank LA movement, which was an outgrowth of the Divest LA movement. Because all these things that you say we need could much more easily happen if we had our own bank. So that leads me to ask you about local and statewide solutions. I know that you have actions at state capitals and you're talking about federal bills, but is there room in the Poor People's Campaign to veer off and advocate for local and statewide legislation if it meets the goals of the 5 pillars?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because and very purposefully in the launch and what we've been working up towards, not been talking about any statewide or local policy, which on one reason is just pragmatic at this point because so many different organizations, hundreds that are part of it, and in California, probably over 100 by now, all have different local and statewide issues they're pushing. We cannot build a platform that honors each of those, which is then, 100 to 500 point platform, which is just policy by policy, what those groups are supporting. So that's not something that we're doing right now. But because this is really literally the beginning of a movement that we are committing to for years, I think that the possibility of it becoming after the launch an open space to listen, to have more groups, I'm sure, join and to see what feels possible and how much headway we make and how much our leaders listen to those demands, it definitely feels open to it growing and changing because it's going to be just after its birthing stage. So I can't say definitively one way or another what it could be, but everything feels open because what we're waiting to see is what the leaders do when they hear us for the next 40 days in Sacramento.
Okay. I have 2 more questions. The first one is faith-based leaders. I mean, obviously, this is a moral movement. And even though I am Jewish by background, I consider myself an atheist, and I don't really go to religious services. And there's no, faith-based leader that I follow. But obviously, Reverend Barber is an evangelical Christian. And I'm wondering, is it part of your plan to try to get as many faith-based, I can't say that, it's a tongue twister, faith-based leaders to be part of the coalition? And if it is part of the plan, how are you doing with that?
Yeah, I think that it's part of the plan in that we're wanting every single leader across any line of identity to come in. So that definitely includes faith leaders. I think that the importance of inviting in rabbis and imams, native indigenous leaders, different Christian faiths, pastors, reverends, as well as atheist leaders, whoever it might be, is because they're a moral leader, so they have communities that can then come into the campaign. And also because the 5th pillar is to address this country's distorted moral narrative, who better than they to be able to go back into their communities and say, we say that we're people of faith. We read all of these different scriptures, which at least if they're from the Abrahamic religion, which I know better because I was also raised culturally Jewish, is that we have to love thy neighbor. We have to be able to take care of each other. And they talk about the poor in the Bible and in the Old Testament, right? And most of these communities aren't directly connecting that a lot of the activism and the organizing that's happening in the communities is a direct link and to the challenges that they can hear about. Is how do we actually take care of each other? How do we actually become better and create a universal community of love and understand, if God is love, then what does that mean actually if I'm denying other people's rights, if I don't care about my neighbors, and I really don't care if people are being deported or whatever it might be. So the moral leadership of faith leaders is essential to be able to bring in those communities. And it's a huge community in the United States who do go to different faith institutions. And we want to bring that poor people well, because it's almost at the epicenter of most faith is talking about taking care of the poor. So that's a part of it, but it's not creating the narrative of the campaign just through the lens of faith. There's many different people across the entire campaign who really don't get so much out of some of the Bible verses. So it's also an open invitation to build an intersectionality that honors whatever really grounds someone, if it's not faith, to understand, how do I begin the process of literally caring about someone else almost as much as I care about myself?
Yes.
And so for a lot of people, that is faith, but for a lot of people, it's just contemplation, or it's action, or it's volunteering. So that's why the campaign feels so amazing to me, not only as someone who isn't very spiritual in a faith and also is queer, is that I can talk about this as openly with someone who is queer in the campaign as someone who is an evangelical preacher, because if they're coming into the campaign, their vocabulary is almost the same, even if their background is different.
Yeah. Well, I like to talk about purpose and meaning. To me, that's a more important thing to strive for than happiness. And I think that doing this kind of work for other people really provides purpose and meaning to your life. And even social psychology has shown that people get more pleasure giving to someone else than buying something for themselves. And it's really too bad that the sociopaths, who are the billionaires and the millionaires who lead American corporations, don't understand that. For them, increasing their wealth is just this game, like Larry Ellison gets mad when, Warren Buffett is higher than him on the Forbes 400 list, and they're all worth over 70, 80 billion, 100 billion. Jeff Bezos is now worth over $100 billion. I mean, this is crazy that these guys are not giving this all away. I mean, it's like immoral, it's obscene, and yeah. All right. So my final question is, for people that are watching and they want to get involved with the campaign, what can they do? What are the various roles that they can take on?
Well, immediately we would just ask them to really sign up on our Facebook page to come to Sacramento. We need people to come. We need them we need them at the state capitol with us. So the best way for them to find out more information and to get plugged in and say, hey, I'd like to volunteer in this role. Hey, I have experience being an art maker and I want to come in. All of that comes through being able to sign up on our page. If they need housing, if they need any support, we're here to be able to try to organize anyone who wants to come from anywhere in California up. And if anyone also wants to inquire about something besides coming to the Capitol, though that's probably what we're going to be mainly doing for the next 6 weeks, is just to let us know and get in touch, and they can email us or just message us on our Facebook page, which is the California Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival.
So I'm going to say goodbye to you now publicly for the show, and wish you great success tomorrow and in the next 40 weeks. And I would love it if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is Lauren from LA, and click the little bell. Unless you click the bell, you're not going to know that I have a new video up. So I'm trying to load a lot more videos up to my YouTube channel. And also you can follow me on Twitter, Lauren_Steiner. So until I see you next, keep fighting.